Recording in progress.
All right. So I decided tonight for my sharing, I was going to do something else originally, and then I switched gears just because I've been paying a lot of attention to different Buddhist communities, not just in the Plum Village tradition, but around, certainly around the United States, in the wake of the election. And, I've noticed there's a pretty common theme that's developing if you look around at some of the larger Zen centers and larger Zen communities and just watching discourse online of people about how they're feeling about the results. And I thought it would be a good opportunity to sort of introduce the 8 realizations of great beings, and the first one in particular really speaks to a way to practice with the social and political conditions of the days in which we find ourselves. And if you're looking for a sharing that's going to rag on one particular group or another, or rub gravel through my hair, or celebrate, this ain't it. So for those of you that are watching on YouTube, the idea behind this is actually just to try and provide a bit of a neutral way of practice. There are some that are very upset about the political result down in the States. There are some that are actually pretty happy about the political result in the States. But the reality is, both extremes, there's a way to practice with sort of both stances and the results. And I think the first realization of the 8 realizations of great beings, it really struck me as a good way to start. So I'm just going to read the first realization again. We listened to the discourse, the musical version, but I'm just going to read the first realization. The first realization is the awareness that the world is impermanent. Political regimes are subject to fall. Things composed of the 4 elements are empty, containing within them the seeds of suffering. Human beings are composed of 5 aggregates and are without a separate self. They're always in the process of change, constantly being born and constantly dying. They are empty of self and without a separate existence. The mind is the source of all confusion, and the body the forest of unwholesome actions. Meditating on this, you can be released from the realm of birth and death. In this first realization, basically, Brother Papai brings out, and Tai was a big fan of this discourse, is basically it touches on the core insights of the Buddha in this first realization, and specifically the core insight of the Buddha's insight into the nature of reality. And the 4 primary pieces that are touched upon in this first realization are impermanence, emptiness, non-self, and one that we don't tend to talk about as much, at least not in the Plum Village tradition that I've noticed about. We kind of do it a little bit when we're talking about the 5 and 14 mindfulness trainings, but we tend to bounce off of it. And it's impurity. And this discourse, as we heard, talks a lot about wholesome and unwholesome actions. And one of the things that we often can forget is that Buddhism is an ethical tradition. And so it's about looking into the nature of reality, but it's also it's doing so with a particular ethic, and that's what makes the tradition. It's a core piece of the tradition. Other Zen teachers like Koshu Uchiyama, in his book Opening the Hand of Thought, boiled down the practice to vow and repentance. And so this idea of zazen, vow and repentance, and the practice over and over and over again, realizing that we never reach the mark of the ideals of the precepts, right, in our practice. And so there's a strong ethical component to it. And these 4 pieces really speak to social and political issues of whatever day that we happen to be in. So I'm just going to give you a couple of quotes from Brother Fat Pai and what he wrote about that particular piece. He said, the first realization really is in Thay's teaching. The real work of transformation is to turn our attention to the everyday. And so in the book, he talks about washing the dishes, etc., etc. Thay Thich Nhat Hanh reminds us that mindfulness is always applied. Engaging deeply with our absolutely ordinary lives is the highest form of spiritual practice. And this includes the collective, social, and political lives. So, there's great debates that are going on, particularly in the States, about whether or not Buddhist communities should be talking about politics and social issues or not. And Thay was of the opinion, and the tradition as a whole is of the opinion, that it's not something you can just leave out. It's part of our everyday life. It impacts every piece of where we're at. And so we practice in the social and political world and realities in which we find ourselves. And in the wake of the most recent presidential and congressional elections down in the States, and we're about to go through something very similar up here in Canada within the next year. We'll be undergoing a federal election at some point. There will be people that are very happy with the result, people are very unhappy with the result, but the reality is reality, and it's the reality that we live in, and therefore it is the reality that we practice in. Full stop. We can, have great consternation about it, we can have great joy about it, but at the end of the day, the reality is the reality, and this is the practice sphere in which we find ourselves. And so in the first realization, it says political regimes are subject to fall. And Brother Fat Pai says that this reminds us that mindfulness can help us live together even in the most devastating times in history. It also encourages us to consider what is properly outside ourselves and what is properly inside ourselves, and what the relationship between what we consider outside and inside to be. So we get into a lot of they, them, they versus us sort of arguments, particularly when it comes to politics. But part of the practice is to situate the fact that there is no they, it's just an us. And we need to keep that in mind as we're going through this practice. And so the four pieces, impermanence, emptiness, non-self, and impurity, are central hallmark features of the first realization and really sum up the Buddhist looking into the nature of reality, and are deeply applied to social and political realities of the days in which we find ourselves. So first, impermanence. So impermanence, everything within and around us is constantly in a state of change. And so the political and social worlds are no exception to this. It doesn't matter where you are, it doesn't matter at what point of history you are, every political regime has fallen. Every single one. Whether we like it, whether we don't like it, it doesn't really matter. It is subject to fall. Every social reality that we find ourselves in is subject to disintegrate. That's the nature of impermanence. And when we're practicing with looking into social and political realities of the day, that's an hallmark feature that we need to remind ourselves. It's an opportunity to touch the preciousness of each and every moment that we find ourselves, because we'll never find and we'll never touch that moment ever again. And so, regardless of the situation, the practice is to look inward and to touch the preciousness of each moment, because it will change. It will move on to something else eventually. The second point in the first realization touches on emptiness. And emptiness, as Brother Phapai, Thai uses a very similar description, but Brother Phapai cuts right through it and just boils it down to one sentence. Emptiness means that nothing can exist by itself. Emptiness is interdependence and interpenetration. Constantly arising, constantly passing away. It's what we call interbeing. And so everything together, nothing exists by itself. So what are we empty of? We're empty of a separate existence. Nothing in this world is its own separate existence. It's all interdependent. It's all interpenetrating. It all influences. And again, this is the social and political fabric of the days in which we find ourselves. And we need to remind ourselves that, you can have a role to play in the manifestation of the reality, but at the end of the day, reality is reality, and we participate in whatever reality that is. We're not separate from that. We're not a separate self from that reality of the world in which we find ourselves. We're part of it. And so it's a good meditation to get into and to realize as we are going through that, the wording, we're constantly arising, being born, and constantly dying. And it's causes and conditions. One cause and condition leads to another cause and condition, which lead to sets of circumstance. And we play a part in that fabric. The third element, non-self, sort of flows also from the emptiness. And so the group, non-self, Brother Phapai says, is the group of processes that we call ourself exists only in relation to an imagined other. I'll say that again. The group of processes that we call ourself only exists in relationship to an imagined other. And so the reality is there is no self that exists separately from the other. We're all part of the same field and fabric of reality. And there is no other in a universal sense. And so when we get into social and political discourse, we have a tendency to consider ourselves and our position being right, and those other people have got it wrong. I was watching today, and actually, interestingly, a clip from the UK, from a UK Parliament from a few years ago, because there was a big discussion about when Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister there, about the words and language that parliamentarians use towards each other and their attitudes towards each other. There was a time when the UK was going through the whole Brexit debate, there was pro-Brexiteers and anti-Brexiteers, and they spent a great deal of time calling each other traitors and othering each other. And one of the MPs from the opposed to the Brexit debate said, listen, when I grew up in a political family, and I grew up thinking that I was the goodie and the people on the opposite side were the baddies. And when I got elected to Parliament, I realized that everybody here essentially has the same goal. They just go about it by different means. And I think in political and social discourse is an important thing to remember. We can get rather cynical about politics and social aspects, but if you really look deeply, the reality is for most people that are engaged in that discourse, they're looking for what they think is the best way to shape a country or shape a city or a province or a state. We may not like it, or we may like it, but the reality is that everybody is kind of coming to the same end more often than not. And we need to remember that what we call ourself and what we call the other, and the person, even the person we disagree with, that exists really as an imagined demarcation. And finally, impurity. So this is one in the social and political world can actually rear its head, and this is where a lot of the fighting comes from. Impurity. So Brother Papai talks about impurity in a few different ways. He says one, impurity is in relation to what is called volition, which is the tendency of being pulled towards or repelled from certain objects of mind each and every moment. And we put our volition, our energy into things that we feel pulled toward and not towards the things that we are repelled from. He goes on to say the interrelationship between our consciousness and the objects of mind, which basically means the world as we see it, creates what we call reality. And what we call reality is only a dim reflection of what is truly there. So impurity deals with the wholesome and the unwholesome. And I actually asked one of my other Zen teachers once to describe for me, what does it mean to be wholesome? Because that's a Zen concept through and through, being attracted to wholesome actions. And we get bombarded with that, certainly in the Western world, from a Christian perspective, all the time. What is wholesome and what is unwholesome? So much so that many people have developed an actual aversion to even using the word wholesome and unwholesome because it comes with a particular religious connotation. But Brother Papai basically breaks it down, and it's like this. Wholesome means leading to freedom and joy. So if something leads to freedom and joy, it is by definition wholesome. Unwholesome means thoughts, words, and actions that contribute to pain and suffering. And so when we're in a social and political discourse, what is wholesome and what is unwholesome? And we have a tendency to think that our position is wholesome, and the other person that may not disagree with us, their position is unwholesome. But really, when we start labeling what's wholesome and unwholesome, we may actually be guilty of unwholesome actions, because our words, our actions, they're contributing to the pain and suffering of the world around us. And so a wholesome way is to listen deeply, to look deeply, to allow an alternative perspective, and allow that freedom and joy of people to express themselves without contributing to the suffering and anger and pain that people develop. And so we can also do it to ourselves if we're disappointed by a particular result in an election, for instance. We can allow ourselves to be bombarded with thoughts, words, and actions that increase our own pain and suffering, rather than turning that around and looking deeply, going inside, coming home to ourselves, realizing that even within the most difficult times, we have freedom and joy to live each moment as a precious moment. And that's a wholesome approach to practice. And so that's the first realization, and particularly in relation to social and political matters of our day. But it's equally applicable, all those points are equally applicable to any moment of practice that we find ourselves, any circumstance. Impermanence, emptiness, non-self, and impurity, wholesome, unwholesome. And so I'm going to stop there, and maybe we'll open up for a few minutes of Dharma sharing.